On this first episode of 2022, time versus distance-based workouts. How do high-level efforts in one discipline carry over into the other two? Ultra running training versus Ironman training. Track running training versus road versus trail. That's a deep discussion. And how to stack your season for 2022. The Endurance Hour podcast starts right now.
Are you listening? Damn.
This question from Andrea. I have a question for you. Why is the bike and run workouts based on time and not distance? Like, for example, when you have a swimming workout, Wendy, for the programs they buy on TrainPeaks, it's usually always distance-based, whereas when we run and bike, sometimes it's time-based versus distance-based. Why is that?
Well, first of all, I like to mix up time and distance in anyone's training program. But, to keep it simple, the bike and run is time-based, especially this time of year. We're in the wintertime, January, because most athletes are training indoors and they're not really riding by distance when you're riding indoors. Even if you ride an app like Zwift or Rouvy or Trainer Road, which will give you distance, it's not the same type of distance that you achieve in an hour indoors that you might achieve in an hour outdoors. So that's basically the reason that bike and run are time-based. And then as the season progresses and the athlete's getting ready into their build phase, race-specific phase, I do like to transfer that time into distance because ultimately you have to cover the distance. Mm-hmm. And whatever time you cover the distance is whatever time, but you have to cover the distance. So distance becomes more included when they're biking and running. And then with regards to swim, I think just basically being a swimmer, I always swim distance. And I think it's more relevant to the athlete. Like for me, a 1,000-yard swim is going to take me 15 minutes, whereas a 1,000-yard swim for, I'd say the majority of people may take like 20 minutes. And so to make structured workouts in the pool time-based, when you don't necessarily know the athlete's paces, makes it a little more difficult. Most swimmers aren't going to swim 2 minutes and stop 2 yards before the wall, or they're not going to stop halfway through the pool because they reach their 2 minutes. They're going to stop at either wall, and that's going to be distance.
And with those run and bike workouts, you can integrate some power or some intervals in there a little easier than maybe the swim, and not worry about distance so much. So because you have a big burst or a big climb, obviously you're not going to cover more. It's just going to take the distance and time and just kind of throw them out the window. It seems like it's a focused workout, whereas, I don't know, you're looking at distance for the pool.
Right. And that brings up a good point. It's hard, especially when you're in our training plans that we sell on TrainPeaks. Again, we don't know the athlete purchasing them. We don't know their experience. So if you use both time and distance, it makes it even harder because in an hour, some days I may run 8 miles, some days I may run 6 miles. So if you structure the workout to be an hour, then you all start and stop at an hour, and distance isn't appropriate for that type of training plan.
Yeah, and the cool thing about the TrainPeaks, you can look back. Let's say you reuse the program you bought. Let's say it's an Olympic distance program that you bought. If you keep it and reuse it, you can look at your data from before, when your training data, and say, okay, during this workout, I did run an hour, and I did log how far I ran. Now, next time around, I ran for an hour, and I logged the distance, and it was faster. You can see your fitness level increase, and also why you add the RPEs in there versus, hey, just run the speed, run at a certain effort level.
Right, exactly. So if you run an hour at an RPE of 5 and you run 6 miles, and then 3 months later you run an hour at RPE of 5, which is the same, and you run 6.5 or 7 miles, that's just a sign of fitness. You're able to run further at the same RPE with the same time.
Give an example of maybe one of the details of a TrainPeaks workout, what it says in there when it comes to a run workout, bike workout, and then swim workout, because based on the question of time-based versus distance-based.
Right. So there's always a warm up, a main set, and a cool down. So the warm up will consist of, usually like a 10-minute warm up for running that usually equates to almost a mile. But it's usually about a 10-minute warm up. And then we do some drills or some strides to get the heart rate up. And then they go into the main set, and the main set might be, you know, 3 by 5 minute efforts at zone 3, zone 4, depending on the phase of training they're in, with a 1 to 2 minute recovery in a zone 1 or RPE of 3. And then they do a cool down of, 5 to 10 minutes. And some athletes are going to go a little bit more. Some athletes are going to do a little bit less, because I always let them know, if you want to do more warm up at that easy endurance effort, or if you want to do more cool down at the easy endurance effort, that's okay. You just want to be hesitant to add more intervals. So if the intervals are supposed to be 3 by 5 minutes at a higher intensity, you don't necessarily want to run 5 or 6 because you feel good. You want to make sure you allow your body to adapt, and then maybe in the future weeks, the intensity level, the number, or the higher volume of intensity over time is going to increase. So just, take it day to day. All the plans are meant to progress with time and distance from week to week, as well as incorporate recovery. So you just want to, stay focused on following the details as intended.
Okay.
And keep a log.
Yeah, always a log. By the way, do a little a promo here, just so people are aware of what programs we have on TrainPeaks, how that works, and some of the benefits, and then we'll throw in a little discount at the end.
So we have, I don't know the number off my head, the top of my head.
22 or 24, yeah.
Yeah, over 20 training plans on TrainPeaks. We have 3 or 4 swims, just bike focused. I think 4 or 5 programs that are just cycling focused, as well as 3 or 4 running programs that are just running focused. And then we have a lot more of the multi-sport focused, sprint, Olympic, half and full, beginner, intermediate, advanced types of programs. And we are very detailed in in the description of what we include in these plans, as well as where you want to start the plan. So, we kind of describe what a beginner, what an intermediate, what an advanced athlete is. And then, if you subscribe to TrainingPeaks, you can get a basic or a premium account, purchase the plan, and it'll download in your TrainingPeaks account exactly when you want to start or when you want to end the plan. So if your race is June 22nd, I always recommend ending the plan on June 22nd, because that's race day.
This from Harrison. He's talking about swimming the 1,000-yard, and I think this has to do with his T-pace testing. And he asks about how this is comparable to possibly a 5K in terms of time. You understand this question, Wendy?
I do, because I actually personally coach Harrison. And so I understand his background, and he's always looking to get faster, which is great. But I'm trying to keep him, be patient, be patient, be patient. It takes time to develop endurance, fitness, speed, and you just you adapt at a different rate than others. So he first started his 1,000, I believe it was over 20 minutes. And just in a matter of a couple months or less, he's now at around 17 and a half minutes for a 1,000-yard swim. So he's improved quite a bit. And he asked me, how does this compare to, is it good? Like, how good is it? Or how does this compare to like an elite swimmer such as myself? Mm-hmm. And so I followed up with them, and I asked him, well, what does that mean? And he said, how does a 1K swim time compare to about an 18-minute 5K time? As a female athlete who has only broken 18 minutes once in my life, and that was back in 2005, I didn't know how fast I was until later, but I'm like, that was a pretty fast 5K time that I broke 18 minutes. That's super fast. And so my equation of swimming around an 18-minute 5K I answered was 12 minutes. As an elite swimmer, I would be swimming a 12-minute or less 1K 1,000-yard time, and that would equate in my mind to an 18-minute 5K. Because I believe back in the day when I did swim, I was under 11 minutes. I was probably closer to about 10 and a half minutes for my 1,000 yards swim when I was an age group swimmer.
Is this kind of based on what the effort it would take to do a 18-minute 5K and the effort it would take to do, a super fast 1,000-yard swim?
It has to do with effort, yes. Yeah. And it also has to do with obviously the experience of a swimmer. An 18-minute 5K for a female is a pretty elite time for a female amateur runner, as well as close to the professionals. They're probably running like 15-minute 5Ks. So I was equating as an elite swimmer what I would swim as an elite swimmer compared to an elite amateur runner, and that's kind of what I came up with.
Is there an equivalent question for cycling? And would it be, I don't know what it would be. Would it be a 10K bike ride, or it'd be I don't know what that would be.
Yeah, so when I think of our baseline fitness test that we provide and all the TrainPeaks training plans that we sell, as well as I use these tests for athletes that I personally coach, our baseline is usually a 1K swim, a 5K run, and a 20 to 30 minute time trial on the bike. So when we're thinking like a 20-minute time trial on the bike, and that's usually your typical functional threshold power test is 20 minutes long, then I would say they're going to be biking 8, 9, 10 miles in 20 minutes.
That's pretty fast.
Yeah.
If it's on a trainer, it's easy to do that.
Yeah. And I know an athlete in Colorado, he can average like 28 miles an hour. So that's about 9 miles in 20 minutes. And I would say that would be 8 or 9 miles in 20 minutes is equivalent to an 18-minute 5K, 12-minute 1K swim. And this is totally just me and my experience and my knowledge and trying to, be a little bit accurate, and it takes a lot.
That's some high-level performance too. My goodness. Yeah, that's got to be very personalized based, right? When it comes to the bike, because I don't know what the power is, and you can get up to some pretty fast speeds without as much power. But if you go more power, how can you sustain that over 20 minutes?
Right, and I'm talking like an outside 20-minute test, not indoors.
Wow.
Because indoors is really different. And then, just because you mentioned power, the fastest cyclist isn't the one with the highest power. It's the one with the highest speed, and it's the one who's most efficient at their managing their power over the terrain, over the course terrain, and how that equates to speed.
Well, you and I have talked about that off air of, you have a lower power threshold. Power to weight ratio is better for you than it is me. I can push more watts. You don't push as many watts, but you could actually go faster than me, just because you have that better the power to weight ratio versus me. I weigh almost 100 pounds more than you. Not quite, but close.
Right, and I think athletes, especially a beginner who's just learning, they forget that. They forget the power to weight ratio is the critical number to think about, not necessarily their power, because you can be an athlete that puts on 20 to 25 pounds, and this actually happened. You can be an athlete that puts on 20 to 25 pounds in the off season, and then you start the season and you're at a higher power, functional threshold power, and that's just because you weigh more and you're able to push more watts because you weigh more. It doesn't mean you're a fitter athlete.
No, yeah. And it's easier for the lighter athletes if they're conditioned to go faster than the bigger athletes.
Right.
If they're conditioned to do so because of that.
Right.
Next one here. This is something more up your alley. Well, they're all up your alley, but this one is a really good one here. It's an ultra runner who's been doing it for quite a few years, and they recently raced Ironman Cozumel. His name is Nate. And he was asking a question about, he's not doing as well as he'd hoped to, and he's trying to balance the difference between, his ultra training and his Ironman training. So can you kind of give a little background on this and what his experience is?
Yeah, so I followed up with him, and I also follow him on Strava, so I know what his training's like. And so he's an ultra runner by heart, that's his first sport is ultra running. And he did Ironman Cozumel, and I didn't even know he was doing that until 2 months before. And I'm like, that's interesting because he's a trail runner, and I don't see much cycling, and I don't think I ever saw a swim training logged on Strava. That doesn't mean he didn't do it. And so he, a month or a couple weeks before the race, he posted on Facebook that he was hoping to go sub 10 hours. And he was feeling really good about his preparedness, yada, yada, yada. And I'm like, oh, running a marathon off the bike is a lot different than running a marathon on the trail or run. It's a lot different than running a 50 miles on the trail. And I understand he just had a hard time giving up run training to focus on cycling and running. And as an experienced coach who's trying to transition multi-sport to ultra or ultra to multi-sport, usually it's the runners, even if it's a marathon runner transitioning to multi-sport, they do have a hard time giving up running because that's their primary sport and they love it. And so I always, when I approach these athletes or they're asking me about coaching, I always tell them, you have to commit to yourself that you're going to give up some run training so you can fit in the necessary volume of swimming and biking. Mm-hmm. And so in his case, he finally recognizes that he didn't put as much purpose onto his bike rides because he'd go and ride, 50 to 100 miles on a mountain bike. And that's a lot harder than 50 to 100 miles on a road bike. And I know he didn't really follow any purpose, structured intervals, endurance, strength, speed threshold intervals. And as an ultra runner, you don't necessarily really do that either, because if you're an ultra runner, most ultra runners are running on ups and downs terrain, that it's a little bit harder to manage, certain heart rate, pace, or power structured intervals when you're running on mountainous terrain. And the purpose of running on mountainous terrain is to get ready for the 50 or 100 mile event. And he definitely didn't put enough time in the pool. And so, I would encourage him, as well as I did, we communicated offline, is he's got to commit to himself. There's a time and a place to be training for ultras, and then you have to kind of give up that type of training, that type of terrain, and focus on multi-sport, which is exactly what I did in 2021. I did all my trail running. I did a 50-mile trail race in May, and then I kind of had a transitional month, and then I said, okay, it's time. I have to mentally, and it was hard for me because I was really into trail running, but I had to let it go and say I'm getting ready for Florida. Mm-hmm. So I went from primarily running on the trails, not much biking, not much swimming, to now running on the road to get my body used to road running, flatter, a little bit more speed, and then getting back onto the bike on the road, as well as doing a little more structure in the pool so I could get my swim to what I thought was reasonable for Ironman Florida. And it was definitely challenging at first. Like at first, I'm like, oh, I don't want to stop trail running. I wish I was doing an 100-miler in the fall instead of Ironman Florida. But then once I got into the training, because I love biking and swimming as well, once I kind of was able to give myself a little month or so transition between training, then I was like, okay, I love my bike again. I'm happy to be back on the bike. And I got myself ready for Florida.
What's your take on using a track, like a high school track or whatever it may be, to do your running for the flat surfaces versus just going out and running a out and back? And the reason I bring this up is because you were talking about making that transition from trail running with the ups and downs to working on the roads, which allows you to work on speed. But there's a monotony about that. A bigger level of monotony when you run around a track. And I see that on Strava sometimes. The people I follow, I see they ran to the high school and they went around the circle. I think I've seen yours do that too. It's like, Are you doing that for speed work, or is it just because it's a controlled environment, easier on your knees, and then you can come back home, versus taking the variety of undulating terrain in your neighborhood?
Okay, that's a great question, because in 2020, if I wasn't running on a trail, I was running on the track. I did very little road running in 2020. It was, and the reason I chose the track was because it was soft. Going from trail running for so many months and then going to the road, I really feel the impact and the hard surface of the road. And because again, I did that similar transition where I was training for an ultra that got canceled, and then I decided to do the virtual races in 2020, and I was getting ready to do a triathlon in the fall. I had to transition from trail running to road, but not to the extreme of an ultra to an Ironman. And so I just really like the soft surface of the track. Mm-hmm. So that was number one. That's kind of the reason I did it that year. But number two is it is flat. It is controllable. I get to be more into using pace to monitor my intensity instead of instead of just RPE or heart rate or power, I really dial in pace when I'm running around the track because it's so controlled. And it is monotonous, but so it's definitely a mindset, and there's definitely got to be a purpose and a reason. And I also know, again, no matter what I'm training for, the 8 to 12 weeks before any race, I'm definitely dialing into specific terrain that I'm going to race on because I have access to trails. I have access to rolling, undulating terrain. I can't avoid hills from my neighborhood at all. And then I also have access to a flat track. And if I need to, I have access to a treadmill. So I have variety. And so, when I'm kind of into my endurance base phase of training, my preparation phase, it doesn't matter what terrain I'm running on. I'm going by RPE and I'm going for strength endurance. But again, as I get closer and closer to the event that I'm training for during the year, I'll get more specific onto the terrain, training on the terrain that the event is going to be held on. Again, another example I'll use is I was going for a 20-minute 5K back in September of 2021. And so for about 4 to 6 weeks, I spent a lot more time around the track because I was getting ready to run that 5K as fast as I could.
And that's a distance you can see and know where you are in that distance.
Yeah.
And there's nothing blocking or stopping you from a stoplight or an intersection or, that kind of thing.
Right. And it was a flat 5K, so I wanted to get myself used to running on flat surface.
I also like the fact that at a track, you can, if you bring your hydration or nutrition, you just put it in one spot and you'll see it in 200 yards.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right there. I was going to ask you this, and I'm not sure if it's a relative question, but if you're to put in order, and this may be dependent on the type of athlete or what you're training for, is what order would you put those 3 surfaces or terrains in order of importance, whether it's track, just road running or trail running, and the pros and cons of each? Obviously, the trail running, there's some strength involved in there, which may not be speed, but it can help with your speed. And then just running on the road, I hope I'm not answering the questions as we go, but you're running on the road, you have the variety, and you can work on speed. And track is pretty much what you're getting. If you had a choice, which one would you choose to do your most training on if you're a triathlete?
That's a good question. I always pick soft surface, number one. Soft surface, whether it's trail or track, soft surface is really important. Okay. The reason I wouldn't choose track is because I would only choose track if you're specifically doing structured intervals. I wouldn't choose a track just to go run a half marathon because that was your endurance run of the week. If you're going for the purpose, it goes back to what's the purpose of your training. If the purpose of your training is just, base miles, aerobic miles, endurance miles, strength miles, choose trail first and then choose road if you have that option. Because when you're just going for endurance and strength, speed is less important, or it should be less important because you're just going for 2 hours. 2 hours is 2 hours. Your body knows, going back to Andrea's question, your body knows time, it doesn't know distance. And so that's another reason that a time-based program is important over a distance-based program. Unless you have never gone the distance, then you have to start going the distance. And then, but roads also very important. Again, going back to that specific phase of training. If you're going to race on the road, you need to let your body run on the road so it gets used to running on the road or training or biking on the road. There's the same question: is it better to bike inside or outside? Just depends on what you're doing and what the focus is. Again, during the base miles, strength miles, I would say riding indoors is great. But as you start to prepare for your event, you got to get outside so you can experience the elements of wind, rain, headwind, tailwind, uphill, downhill.
The gravity.
Yeah.
So there isn't just one way to train, but if you train one way, it seems to have some limiters. I don't know if it's famously or not, but Andy Potts, an Ironman champion and he's a 70.3 world champion as well, and just wins a lot of the races. He's been known to be doing all his bike training on the trainer indoors, and a lot of athletes do that for safety and control and whatever. But if it's all you did, then you're missing out on some of the variables of being outside. So, one's not better than the other, but they all work together, and you shouldn't probably just do one.
Right. You shouldn't just do one. I think, and again, with my experience and having done everything, um, it's best to do both if possible.
Yeah, variety.
But don't like lose hope if you can only do one or the other.
Good point. Good point. Yeah, because
Because
yeah.
back in the day when I started, we didn't have these smart trainers. We didn't have power. Alls I did was my outdoor activities. Like that's what I did. It wasn't even a question of training indoors because I was a swimmer. I wanted to be outdoors.
Yeah.
I was stuck inside the pool as an age group swimmer. So I enjoyed the outdoors as much as possible. And now with the smart trainer, it makes indoor riding easier, and trail running to me makes outdoor running easier when I'm on the trails.
Let's finish up with this topic here as we're beginning the new year, the new season, is stacking your season. For those who have put on their bucket list, or maybe they're adding another one to their collage of Ironman finishes, that being an A race, and then you throw in a B race as a 70.3, and then there's the Olympics and sprints. How would you stack the season based on distances between events if your A race is an Ironman? So if I'm make it clear, or overdoing this, is how far back would you space a half before a full, and how would you sprinkle in Olympics as a general rule of thumb?
First, I just want to point out it really just depends on the experience of an athlete. If I'm coaching a beginner athlete and the Ironman is going to be their very first Ironman, I always advise them not to be racing 8 weeks before their Ironman, if possible, because that's where they're wanting to get that Ironman specific endurance and intensity level in that 8 weeks, 8 to 12 weeks beforehand. If an athlete is not able to do a half Ironman before their Ironman, unless it's within that 8 weeks, because I know athletes who throw in a half Ironman 4 weeks before an Ironman. And as a beginner, I try not to allow them to do that. But if that's their only half Ironman that they can get in before their first Ironman, well, we work around it, and that's great. If you're an experienced athlete, doing a half Ironman before an Ironman is fine. It's fair game because this is not your first Ironman. So that's how you want to make sure you decide, is it your first one or not? And then, so let's say the Ironman is in November. I'd say I would want them to do maybe a peak half Ironman, maybe in June. So they're kind of developing their season where they're training specifically to peak in June. They have a little recovery, and then they start their Ironman training after that. So I'd say June, give them a chance to get that experience. And then there's time maybe to do another one in August or September before that 8-week Ironman build. So then maybe they can get in 2 half Ironmans before their Ironman that happens to be in November. And then maybe, so again, we're going to the November Ironman. Maybe they'll do a half in June and another half in August. And then before that, hopefully before their half, they'll have time to do a sprint or an Olympic before the half.
When and how, or should you sprinkle in some Olympics between those half Ironman races and Ironman races? Is it even beneficial because there's such a short distance to do?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And again, if you have it, it depends your experience, and depends on how long your training season is going to be before the Ironman. But I think doing sprints and Olympics sprinkled in the first half of the season, especially before half Ironman if possible. So let's say that first half Ironman's in June. If you can fit in some sprints and Olympics in, March, April, or May, that would be ideal. Or do them on your own, do your own sprint or own Olympic distance locally if you can't find an event to travel to. Because I think the more racing you get, whether it's short or longer, this kind of the more fun it's going to be for you, and you're just going to get more intensity and just reach a different fitness level when you race. Because regardless of whether you're a beginner or not, when you race, you go hard. And so you just learn a lot about your body, what it's capable of, to give you some confidence. And you learn a lot about nutrition and hydration before, during, and after. So there's just a lot of variables that happen when you race. But like I said, I wouldn't race 8 to 12 weeks out from an Ironman if you've already had some racing experience before that time period.
Okay. Just some food for thought for those of you who are looking at their season, and how do you stack it up a little bit to to make it the best for you and peak when it's time to peak.
Yes, and I want to add to that because I actually started writing an article last year, at the end of last year. Racing, it takes a lot out of you. Even if it's just a sprint, everyone always is going to rest a few days beforehand, and then maybe traveling's included, traveling to the venue, traveling after the venue, and it does take a lot out of you. And so that's why another reason I don't like racing that much before your Ironman event, because it's just a lot of time that you are not Ironman specific training because you're traveling.
Well, great topics and discussions today for this episode of the Endurance Hour podcast, the first episode of 2022. We debuted in January of 2012. So is this officially, how many years? Is it 10 or how is it working? Either way, we started in 2012 and now we're here at 2022, still going strong. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. For Wendy Mader, I'm Dave Erickson. Have a great week of training, racing, or recovery. We'll see you back here next time. Adios.
Adios.